Alright, hello, we're back with another video. Today we're talking about this pretty little thing right here, Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, the last book he wrote in his life before he died. Yeah, he only wrote, this book has 5 sections, he only wrote the first section out of the 5, and then he edited the rest, so he did put his stamp of approval on the other 4, but I guess his 4 of his students or prodigies or what have you wrote the other 4 sections. So I'm not going to give like a direct summary of the 5 sections. I'm kind of just going to talk generally about Jung, and hopefully this is the first of many. I'd love to do more on Jung, so I can almost promise you there will be more at some indeterminate point in the future. But yeah, I will draw most of my summary and things I'm going to talk about from sections 1, 2, and 3. To be honest, I didn't get much out of 4 and 5, but hey, they were alright. I'll give a brief synopsis, but yeah, 1 through 3, that's where the good stuff was. I got my notes here, so yeah, why don't we get started? So yeah, if you haven't heard the name Jung before, you're probably living under a rock. He's a Swiss psychiatrist, famous for collaborating and breaking off from Freud. Born 1875, died 1961, so not too long ago. I guess my grandparents would have been alive at the same time that he was. So that's kind of cool. Of course, in his earlier years, he was a disciple of Freud, but later broke away for several reasons. A few of them being Freud was kind of dogmatic in his claim that sexuality was kind of the core motivation of all human desires and behavior. So Jung thought it could be a motivator, but wasn't as core as Freud was claiming. And then Jung also didn't agree with Freud's limited view of the unconscious. So for Freud, it was totally an individual thing, but for Jung, he saw a greater influence of sort of humans' like biological structure of the psyche and the brain, and thus came up with the idea of the collective unconscious, which we'll talk about. And then he also didn't like Freud's conception of the dream. So Freud kind of had this idea that the dream was just it had one clear interpretation, and the subconscious kind of just screwed it up and made it all these weird symbols, and you had to decipher it to get to the idea that was behind the dream. Whereas Jung sort of saw the dream more as like a natural product of nature, and the unconscious was kind of doing its best to give you the best picture. It wasn't sort of trying to obscure the truth or anything like that. So I guess we should kind of back up a little bit and talk more about these terms. So Freud and Jung each had their own models for the psyche, right? Freud had of the id, the ego, and the superego. That was his kind of structure. And Jung's is a bit more complicated here. I've got it on the computer screen. I don't know if you'll be able to see it here. There's a lot of things on here. Basically, you need to know that in the consciousness, on the top half, you have the ego. And that's kind of the thing that makes the decisions. Oh, wow, it turned off right as I was talking about it. That's great. And then below the ego, you have everything that's unconscious. So the negative part of the ego, or the shadow. And then you have the personal unconscious, and then below that you have the collective unconscious, where you have the anima, animus, archetypes, things like that. And then you have the self. And the self is kind of like the daemon in Greek, as Socrates would have it. It's who you really are, the core. So let's see if I can get my camera back in the right spot here. So anyways, that's Jung's scheme of the psyche. And so one thing that's interesting in terms of the unconscious, especially as it relates to archetypes and symbols and so forth, is that Jung ultimately sees archetypes as rooted in biology. So I've got a quote here. I think this is section 3. It says, or maybe it's 4 actually. So this is one of his disciples quoting him. It says, he is referring to Jung. The deeper layers of the psyche, Jung has said, lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat further and farther down into darkness. Lower down, that is to say, as they approach the autonomous functional systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, i.e. in chemical substances. hence at bottom the psyche is simply world. So yeah, I guess the universal quality of archetypes is rooted in our universal biology, which makes total sense, right? So that's something interesting to note. What else do we got here? Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the collective unconscious. So I don't know, I've got notes in here somewhere on that. So the unconscious generally consists of nebulous thoughts and ideas that are sort of out of focus, and they influence the conscious mind in ways that we aren't always aware of, right? That's hence their being unconscious. And certain cues or triggers can bring unconscious material into the conscious mind. Another thing would be dreams. Dreams also bring unconscious material into the conscious mind, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. So yeah, the collective unconscious, it's the space where archetypes are kept. And another thing about archetypes, I guess I'm jumping the gun here, but the idea is that they're not always universally realized, right? So like, let's say you have somebody in prehistoric India, and then you have like a Native American in the Americas. They both will have a hero figure in their archetype, in their collective unconscious, right? They'll both see that archetype in their myths, in their dreams, but they're not going to see the exact same thing. So Jung is not claiming that archetypes are particular in their manifestation. Actually, archetypes are structures in our subconscious or in our unconscious, and they are only realized or manifested, fleshed out in the particular. So I'm totally making this up, but for example, the archetype of the hero realized in somebody in India might look, in terms of dress and in terms of behavior, would look different than maybe a Comanche Indian, right? So it's not the particulars that matter; it's the scheme or the structure. What else can I say about the? Yeah. So again, in regards to consciousness, Jung doesn't necessarily see consciousness as we now experience it as something that is eternally particular to the human species. Instead, Jung sees consciousness as developed or evolved over time. So back to part one here. So Jung, he had experience, or a lot of, I'm not sure if he actually went or if it was mostly reading, but anyways, he had experience observing primitive peoples in, different parts of the world, and he thinks that those people are like lower on their like progression in terms of consciousness, and one thing that I guess Jung would want to pipe up and say right away is not as evolved in terms of consciousness doesn't mean worse, because as civilized people have like become more conscious in the way we currently experience it, they've actually lost a lot of function. And so Jung doesn't see like the civilized man as necessarily better in the sense of their conscious experience. In fact, he might actually see them as inferior, because primitive people, as per Jung, their soul is very connected to the unconscious and to nature. They don't have this divide or disconnect. And so he points to things like the bush soul or the spirit animal as examples of how their mind is more in tune, I suppose, with the unconscious. Whereas modern people, they have a very big split. And he, of course, in his day, he likes to point sort of towards the divide between the Eastern countries, the Eastern Bloc, and then Western countries, and as that sort of being like a physical manifestation of the divide in modern man in their psyche, right? As the progression or the evolution of the human mind would be such that we were in tune with our unconscious and with symbols and archetypes and all that stuff, and we kind of intuitively understood those things, and as we became more conscious, this is sort of like a fragile new development, and that sort of we became divorced from our unconscious, and now we are kind of floundering, right? We're trying to reconnect with our unconscious, but it's a difficult process. And then Jung would predict then in his scheme that the final stage of psychological development would be sort of a reintegration of the conscious, objective mind, the rational mind, with the irrational, emotive subconscious. That would kind of be like the future, like a utopian state. What else do we got here? Yeah, so on a personal level, not just like in terms of like evolution of the human species, but on a personal level, the need for rational man or civilized man to reintegrate their subconscious. It's called individuation. And the goal of individuation is to reveal the self, right? Which is that core essence of who you are as a person. And the way you do that is through analyzing your dreams. So the dreams are the unconscious serving up to you in the form of symbols and archetypes, the things that are maybe holding you back, or certain pathologies that you have that need to be worked through in order for you to like sort of reach the final stage of integration or maturation of the psyche. I've been doing a lot of talking and not a lot of looking at my notes, so I feel like I'm skipping stuff here. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm getting most of it. Anyways, yeah. So in Jung's scheme, the goal of dreams and symbols is to help the individual work through that divide that they have between the conscious rational mind and the subconscious or the unconscious, sort of to heal that. So that's what Jung's sort of telos for man would be. And then I have some quotations here on archetypes. I'll read those right from the text. So it says, common inherited patterns of emotional and mental behavior. So that's the definition that Jung would agree with for the archetype. It's common inherited patterns of emotional and mental behavior. So a lot of people, when they think of archetypes, they think of like Beauty and the Beast, the hero, the wise old man or woman, right? So an archetype can be a person. That's absolutely true. But archetypes can also be situations or themes, right? So an archetypal theme would be betrayal or rebirth, death and rebirth, right? Or let's think of another one. Or I guess here's not a person or a situation, but like a house on a hill. A house on a hill is not a person or a situation, but it's still an archetypal thing, right? Sorry, not a house on a hill, a city on a hill. Or here's another example, a golden age, a utopia. That's another archetypal thing, right? So archetypes can be sort of a few different things. Here is a summary of what archetypes are and what they do. And this is also from the conclusion of the book. Who is this writing here? M.L. Von Franz is writing, and they say, all we can see now is that the archetypes have an enormous impact on the individual, forming his emotions by his ethical and mental outlook, influencing his relationships with others, and thus affecting his whole destiny. We can also see how the arrangement of archetypal symbols follows a pattern of wholeness in the individual, and that an appropriate understanding of these symbols can have a healing effect. He's referring to individuation. And we can see that the archetypes here can act as creative or destructive forces in our mind. Some creative when they inspire new ideas, destructive when these same ideas stiffen into conscious prejudices that inhibit further discoveries. So, moving on here, past the archetypes, I also wanted to talk about something that is also in the collective unconscious, and that is the shadow, the anima, and the animus. Now, sorry, I misspoke. The shadow is not part of the collective unconscious, but it is part of the personal unconscious. And then the anima and the animus are part of the collective unconscious. So, where do I have that here? Yeah, so the shadow is the opposite of the ego. They're part of the same thing, but the qualities and the characteristics are the opposite. So the ego is usually, because it's conscious, it's usually positive traits, right? Like, most people try to like be nice and do good things, but they're idiosyncratic, right? They do things that maybe are particular to them and aren't good or bad, but are kind of just unique. or maybe the way they go about doing something is idiosyncratic. And every set of like personality traits or characteristics have an opposite. And those would be the things that are part of the shadow. And usually people sort of intuitively recognize their shadow because if they see it in somebody else, they hate it right away. And it's not like a dislike that's like I cannot get along with that person. So I'm trying to think of an example. So an example would be if you are very particular about always trying to listen really well to everybody. So whenever someone's telling a story or they're like revealing something about themselves, you always try to like engage with them and just sit down and really listen. So if you were to see somebody kind of open up to somebody else and that person kind of just brushed them off and they didn't really listen, you wouldn't just correct that person, but you would like kind of feel intense emotion towards that because that's something that you are very particular about. So that brushing off and not listening, that would be, for that person, that would be something that would be part of their shadow. Moving on to the anima. So the anima is the feminine part of the male unconscious, and then the animus is the male part of the feminine unconscious. And so in terms of the anima, that's the feminine part of men, the anima is formed by the mother in childhood, and it can be positive or negative, and that goes to the animus as well, right? So when it's negative, or it's unintegrated or neglected, it makes a man overly sensitive, it makes him kind of nitpicky, like nagging. It may give him erotic fantasies that are kind of intrusive. However, when it's integrated or it's acknowledged, it's mature, it's positive, it acts as a guide to the self, or a mediator between the self and the ego. So it helps to reveal the unconscious material more easily. It has 4 general stages that's pointed out in the book. The first being that of Eve. It's pure instinct, biological functions, so sexuality. The second stage is Faust's Helen, so very beautiful, romantic, aesthetic, still mainly sexual. The third stage would be symbolized by the Virgin Mary, which has love as a spiritual devotion. And then the fourth most mature stage would be Sophia, wisdom itself. And then in terms of individuation for the man, they integrate their anima by taking their feelings and fantasies seriously, instead of just brushing them off as dreams or daydreams or whatever. Taking them seriously, observing them, analyzing them, that'll help to integrate the anima. In terms of the animus, it's set by the woman's father in childhood. It's not an erotic fantasy or mood like it is for the man. Instead, it's a hidden, sacred or secret conviction or ideal that the woman doesn't really know why, but they uphold very strongly. And so if others, she may try to force it on other people, or if other people are abusing or contradicting the ideal, she might get emotional or angry or react. So when the animus becomes conscious, so for example in dreams, it might manifest as meeting or revealing an unknown lover, right? So think of the story of Cupid and Psyche. Or perhaps Beauty and the Beast, or the Frog Prince, right? They kiss the frog, becomes the prince. Something like that, right? So an integrated or healthy animus enables the woman to act out her masculine traits or virtues without hindering her femininity, right? So things like initiative, courage, objectivity, right? It also has 4 stages of development, like the anima. So the first stage is the muscle man, like purely instinctual, physical power, right? The second one is the man of initiative or planned action. The third being the professor or clergyman, a man of the word. And then 4th stage, the most integrated, would be that of meaning. So it's a mediator of a religious experience. And then women who get to this stage are known as like oracles. And the way to progress for women would be, instead of for the man it was to take their feelings seriously, for the woman it's to question her sacred convictions. Why do I feel this way? Why am I convicted about this or that issue? And when I say convictions, I'm not talking about religious convictions that are like Jesus is the Son of God, right? That's a rational religious conviction. I'm talking about unique sort of fixations that they have. I also wanted to talk about some examples of archetypes. So I'm jumping back a little bit here. I got mixed up. So I already mentioned the hero, right? So yeah, just briefly, the hero appears in the dream when the ego needs strengthening, often to in terms of the ego needs to strengthen in order to mature by coming into terms with reality, right? So when the adolescent is growing up, they might experience the hero in their dream in terms of coming to grips with adult society, responsibilities, things like that. Another archetypal situation is the initiation ritual. And Jung also provides, or I don't think it's Jung's section, it's the second section, but the author of that section provides good examples of initiatory rituals for men and women, so kind of playing back onto anima-animus dynamics. So the initiation ritual, it's archetypal, and it takes the juvenile or the adolescent, and it kind of initiates them into adulthood, right? And the function is to tame the animalistic or base nature and bring them into maturity, right? So it would play a role in individuation as well. So for the man, it is the trait of the juvenile would be that of individual uniqueness, idiosyncrasy, and then the initiation ritual brings them into right relationship with the group, right? So it has that sort of the death of the individual kind of feel to it. So yeah, themes of death and rebirth. And then for women, the initiation ritual frees her from her relatedness to the group or interconnectedness, and instead establishes her as an individual. So it's the exact opposite. And an interesting note is that marriage, at least as the Jungians see it, can act as an initiation ritual in both directions for both sexes. So that's pretty interesting. Another reason to get married. Many women, especially in modern society, tend to internalize the masculine hero myth or archetype in school when they're growing up, because school, of course, is a very masculine environment. At least it was. I don't know about nowadays, but and in order to continue on her path of individuation, she has to let the hero archetype let it go, in order that she can, relate to men properly. And another piece of it would be to integrate her intellectual creative drive with her instinctual ability to mature, or to nurture, and relate to others. So, yeah, that's all on initiation. I'll give a quick summary here of sections 4 and 5. Section 4 was mostly on art and how archetypes influence art, which is cool, but it's mostly just like kind of a list of names. I didn't really... It was cool, but it wasn't something to memorize, I guess. So the author talks about the stone, the animal, and the circle. The stone being a dwelling place of spirits, the animal being representative of a man's instinctual or primitive nature, and then the circle being a symbol of wholeness in the self, whereas the square is the opposite, right? It symbolizes body, earth, something that's lower matter, right? And the point of the section really is just to demonstrate that the rift that modern man experiences between nature and mind, consciousness and unconsciousness, is represented very strongly in art. And then section 5 was interesting. It was one of the authors doing an actual analysis on a real life person to kind of see what that would look like. And yeah, it's a story of a successful psychoanalysis by a Jungian, and the guy he calls Henry has a mother tie from an overbearing mother, and also is overly rational and introverted. And then he has various dreams, and the author gives his interpretation of these dreams, and he helps Henry, or the guy, to come to terms with his own anima, which is representative of the irrationality and the feeling sensuous nature within himself. And he also comes to terms with the outer world and responsibility, and is able as a result to marry his fiancée and take on more responsibilities in the world. So that's cool. The last thing I want to talk about in this video, because after that absolutely butchered summary of the book, I was all over the place, but hey. The last thing I want to talk about is Jung's view of the human being and of the psyche and all that, and how that relates to Christianity. So, where am I? I lost my spot here. Yeah, so on 76, page 76, there's an interesting quotation where Jung talks more directly about religion, and I think it almost exposes him as an atheist, or at least a naturalist. He thinks that religious things are explained by human biology, right? That's its whole thing, right? Is that things that are highly symbolic come from the unconscious, and the unconscious is the reason it's universal is because it's rooted in our biology. Like that quote I read at the beginning. And so religion, well, it's highly symbolic, which means it must root from our biology, right? In that sense, it's not true, right? It's true only in the sense that we experience it, but it's not true in the sense that it exists in its own way outside of us, right? So like a conventional Christian wouldn't necessarily believe with Jung's take, at least on religion. So where are we? We're on page 76, I said, here. Where should I start reading from? I'll read this paragraph. So Jung writes, modern man may assert that he can dispose with them being religious symbols and convictions. Dispose with them, and he may bolster his opinion by insisting that there is no scientific evidence of their truth, or he may regret the loss of his convictions. But since we are dealing with invisible and unknowable things, for God is beyond human understanding, and there is no means of providing immortality, why should we bother about evidence? Even if we did not know by reason our need for salt in our food, we would still nonetheless profit from its use. We might argue that the use of salt is a mere illusion, or taste, or superstition, but it would still contribute to our well-being. Why then should we deprive ourselves of views that would prove helpful in crises, and give us meaning to our existence? And how do we know that such ideas are not true? Many people would agree with me that if I stated flatly that such ideas are probably illusions. I don't think most people would probably agree with you, but okay. What they fail to realize is that the denial is as impossible to prove as the assertion of religious belief. We are entirely free to choose which point of view to take. It will in any case be an arbitrary decision. I don't think it's an arbitrary decision, personally, and I don't think I would agree that most people would agree that such ideas are probably illusions, as he states, so I don't know where he got that from. Anyways, it makes it seem here that he's not really a Christian, right? He just kind of thinks that beliefs are useful, but not necessarily true. So, kind of cringe, but hey, he was a smart guy, so we'll let it slide on that one. But we're not going to agree with him on that, but we'll let it slide. Also, another thing I disagree with is his conception of dreams. So I think there are multiple kinds of dreams, and I think that many dreams are like the type he describes, right? The dreams are the unconscious serving up unconscious material in the form of symbols and archetypes. Totally on board with that. But I don't think that that's the only function of dreams, right? I think dreams can also be divine or come from God, right? And so the scripture that I'm ripping out of context here, not necessarily out of context, that's tongue-in-cheek, of course, but I'm taking from Job 33:15-18. It says, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to keep them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride, to preserve them from the pit, their lives from perishing by the sword. So in Job here, it's saying basically that, well, God could send us dreams to kind of prevent us from falling into worldly traps that would not only give us worldly consequences, but also keep us from going to hell. So I mean, it's scripture. I would tend to agree with it. So I think that maybe Jung is mistaking the part for the whole, and he's saying that dreams are always like this, but I don't think that's necessarily true. That's more of a small quibble, I guess. Another thing that I would point out in terms of Christianity and Jungianism is that Jung puts this big emphasis on individuation as kind of like the core human experience. That's like the telos, the point of life is to integrate the personality, the psyche, and come to terms with the self. Now, this scheme is particularly absent from the Bible, right? One thing the Bible is kind of clear on is what Protestants would call sanctification, right? of course, glorification and justification are also necessary for salvation, but I'm focusing here on like our earthly experience. Sanctification is probably the closest thing that we can think of to individuation in the Christian scheme. So I was thinking how those two things relate to each other, and I found two key differences. Individuation is very focused only on the self, right? How do I experience these symbols? What do they mean for me? What are the fixations that I have to work through, etc., etc. Whereas in Christianity, sanctification is often thought of in terms of virtue, and that's often in terms of service, right? Like, how can I further the kingdom? How can I love God and love others? It's kind of, the focus is on others, not always just the self. So that's one of the key differences, is others versus self. The second thing is the process by which the person is individuated is through symbols, right? Through dreams. Whereas in Christianity, the way you become sanctified is by, dwelling in the Word, praying. You're developing virtue and avoiding sin, right? So those things are kind of totally separate, because the symbols come from the unconscious, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's from within you, right? Whereas virtue is something that is an objective standard that exists outside of ourselves. So I guess in both of these differences, the thing is that we're not following our own inner feelings or thoughts. We're focusing on God, others, and Scripture, which are outside of ourselves. They're more kind of objective or standard, I suppose. Another small thing, another difference, is that Jung sees the human nature as evolving. So I talked at the beginning about primitives and how they have the bush soul and how they kind of progress over time. And civilized man has this rift between their unconscious and their consciousness, and they're going to evolve again to sort of reintegrate those two pieces. Whereas in the Bible, human nature is sort of more portrayed as sort of unchanging, right? Like, we have this original sin, and throughout all generations, humans are just learning to fight against that sin and become virtuous, right? So that's another thing, is this idea of evolution of the human psyche. I think that's a little bit different from the Christian scheme. And then lastly here, I've also got a few things. I talked about the two key differences between sanctification and individuation being like focus on the self versus focus on the other. On page 165 here, I want to read you a little excerpt, and it has to do with that same idea or division. It says, in order to bring the individuation process into reality, one must surrender consciously to the power of the unconscious, instead of thinking in terms of what one should do, or what is generally thought right, or of what usually happens. One must simply listen in order to learn what the inner totality, the self, wants to do here and now in a particular situation. So he's basically saying that in order for it to become individuated, you have to submit to the unconscious and listen to the self. Right? That's very contrary to what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know it? Right? So this key distinction between the self and the Word, or the Logos, God, that distinction is important. Lastly, I just wanted to point out that, like, I'm gonna in terms of what I think in general of Jung's scheme, is that it's good, it's useful, but he mistakes the part for the whole. And I'm very Feyerabendian, right? Paul Feyerabend, in terms of my thinking and the way that I like to organize the world, right? I like to think of it in terms of tools in the toolbox, mental models, right? So the whole idea behind Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism is that ways of thinking should not be totalizing, right? Instead, they are systems that we use as tools. And when we want a particular answer, we can use a particular tool to get that answer. And so I think Jung's scheme is great. It's super useful, but you cannot just like dive into it head first and get lost in the weeds, because it's not the whole story, right? And if you only look at like different things like literature, your own personal experience, your relationships with others, if you only look at your life through the Jungian lens, it's a very impoverished view of the world, right? It's not the whole picture. So an example I want to point out is in the second section, the author states that like the damsel in distress, that archetype, as in the hero myth, so the damsel in distress is a representation of the anima, which I think it can be, but is it always? Jung would probably say yes, but I would say no, right? Because sometimes it could just be that like a strong and competent man wants to rescue a sexy lady, right? Like they might not have some sort of like mother tie or fixation or something like that. Like they might be a healthy, integrated individual and they still want to pursue the damsel in distress, right? So sometimes when I hear a Jungian explanation, not always, but sometimes when I hear the explanation of someone's behavior or dream in a Jungian way, I'll think it's not that deep. Like it's really just not that deep. You're finding symbols where there are none. So yeah, just think Jungian view, tool in the toolbox. Don't take it too far. Anyways, super fascinating stuff. Definitely gonna read more Jung. Sorry, I actually butchered that summary of the book. I have so many notes here, and I didn't integrate them properly into my psyche before I recorded this. So, anyways, yeah. Thanks for tuning in. See you later.